say there's too many immigrants. Higher shares than in other high-income countries. Similarly, in terms of salience, so how important an issue is immigration to the public. Again, the UK stands out, although in the US you've got a fairly high ranking as well. So if you ask, will immigration influence your vote a lot? Again, in the UK, over a quarter of the population say that it will. And if you ask, what's the most important problem facing the country? In the UK, almost 25% of people will say it's immigration. Okay. So the key question that we ask is, who do people have in mind when they think about immigrants? Because a lot of government policy is made in response to public opinion. Actually, the current government's policy of rapidly reducing immigration is very explicitly based on public opinion. So one point I want to make is that if you ask people in this country, are there too many immigrants? Has immigration gone too far? Over time, you get pretty consistent answers. Which means the point I'm trying to make is that opposition to immigration in this country has been long-standing, is not new. We often hear 60% of the public are against immigration. Well, this has been true since at least the early 1960s. So the three results of opinion polls, they're in different colors because the questions are slightly different. So the answers are not directly comparable. So this graph does not suggest necessarily that public opinion on immigration has become more favorable. But the point I'm trying to make is, for a long time, most people in this country say, in one way or another, they want fewer migrants. There's too many. So what we did was we conducted a survey, a public opinion poll, with Ipsos Mori, and we asked, when you think about immigrants coming to and living in Britain, which of the groups would you normally think about? Who do you normally think about in terms of nationality? So what most people think about is citizens of non-EU countries, 60%, followed by citizens of EU countries. Few people think about naturalized British citizens. So these are people who were born abroad who've now become British nationals. Actually, less than 40% think of those as immigrants, even though technically, in a lot of the analysis, they're foreign-born and they would be included in the debate. So there's a difference by where people come from. Now this is quite interesting, because we also ask people, when you think about immigrants coming to Britain, which groups would you normally think about by length of stay? Those staying permanently, more than 5 years, fewer than 5 years. And very clearly, you see that when people think about immigrants, overwhelmingly they think about people who stay permanently. Okay, it's permanent immigrants that people are thinking about when they answer questions to immigration. Now the most interesting response, I think, was this one. So we asked, when you think about immigrants, who do you think about in terms of category? So we've got asylum seekers, we've got students, we've got family, we've got workers. Now, by far, the biggest share of respondents say they think of asylum seekers. Okay, over 60% of people in this country think of asylum seekers when they answer questions about immigration, followed by work, family, and fewer than 30% think of students. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is almost completely in inverse correlation to the actual numbers coming in. Okay? By far the biggest group of immigrants in this country are students. Students coming in. EU students and non-EU students. They're the biggest numbers. And by far the smallest group are asylum seekers. Asylum seekers constitute 1 to 2%, maybe something around that, maybe 5% of all immigration flows. So you can see the problem that creates for interpreting public opinion data. That people think about asylum seekers, but actually asylum seekers don't feature in the numbers really in a big way at all anymore. We also asked, if you want immigration reduced, which specific categories do you want reduced? Okay. Now, the least popular kinds of immigrants, maybe unsurprisingly, to the right, are low-skilled workers. Maybe that's not a surprise. Followed by extended family members, asylum seekers. The most popular types of immigrants, who only 30% want reduced, are university students, which is good for this university, fair education colleges, high-skilled workers, and English language students. Okay? Now, the problem for government is that low-skilled workers who are least popular are mostly from other European Union countries, which the government cannot control. Okay, the large numbers, the public really doesn't like them. The public says, we want few of them, the government has no control over them. Okay? Extended family members actually have been reduced to almost nothing in terms of numbers in this country. You cannot do much more in terms of reducing extended family members because there's very few left. Asylum seekers numerically small, as I said. So this is what the public wants. Reduce those, but the numbers are so small that if government did that, it would make very little impact on overall numbers. Okay? Now, these are the ones that government can control. Non-EU students, high-skilled workers, but those groups, of course, tend to be the most economically beneficial. Right? So, the point I'm trying to make is that when you interpret public opinion data, it's very important to ask who do people have in mind. And there's a real problem for government when it wants to respond to public opinion. Because to some extent, the government does not have the tools to deliver on the demands that the public makes. Because the kinds of migration that the public wants reduced, low-skilled workers, are in fact mostly from Eastern Europe. And the government cannot stop them, easily at least. Okay, so I think that's maybe something to think about on public opinion. Now, the second question I want to move on to, as I said, is the following. A lot of labor immigration starts with an employer or various employers saying they need migrant workers. So the typical claim that employers make is that we need migrant workers to fill labor and skills shortages that domestic workers cannot or will not do. Okay, so employers typically say British workers can't do these jobs either because they don't have the skills or because they're lazy, they're not going to pick the mushrooms, they're not going to work in the food processing factory, they're not going to do the work, we need migrants. So it's then the job of government to evaluate this claim and to decide how to respond to it. So by evaluation I mean, ideally we need some analysis that tries to figure out, well, is it true that there is a shortage of workers in this particular job? And if so, is immigration the answer? Do we want to provide this sector with more migrant workers? So this is a question that colleagues and I discussed in this book, which has come out a couple of years ago, Who Needs Migrant Workers? So we looked at different sectors of the economy and asked precisely, how can you evaluate claims about shortages, and how can you help government decide how to respond to such claims? Now, one thing which is quite clear, I think, or should be clear, some people will disagree, is that, in my view, most countries, or many people will argue that immigration policy should be made in the national interest. Now, there's a question about how you define national interest, but at a minimum, I would argue, the national interest includes more than just employers' interests. Okay? So just because there's employers saying they're desperate for more migrant workers, in my view, that doesn't necessarily make a good case for more immigration. It could be, but I've rarely met an employer who doesn't want to increase the labor supply, who doesn't want skills from abroad. Of course, from a business point of view, employers want access to the best possible labor supply, to the workers with the best skills. Employers generally don't care, at least the ones I've spoken to. Employers say, well, they don't care where the worker comes from. They just want the best worker for the business. So it's, we're into maximizing profits. So I think the reason why we need to critically interrogate the claim is that employers are saying something, and we need to check whether, from the whole economist and society's point of view, this is a good idea, satisfying that claim. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of claims that employers make, just to illustrate some of this. So, as part of the kind of government advisory work that I do, I get to travel around the UK to talk to employers, and they say they need migrant workers, and we need to find out what drives those shortages. So I'll just give you one example. There's one employer, a fish processing factory, specializing in exporting mackerels, okay, to Japan. And the shortage was for a worker who could fillet mackerels from frozen. Okay? And the claim that this employer made that there's only one worker in the whole world who can do this job well. Only one kind of worker. And that worker is a Chinese worker who was trained in Japan. So this company was making a case to government saying we need more migrant workers, non-EU, but not just anyone. We want Chinese workers trained in Japan. So we go there. I should say I don't know anything about fish at all, so I learned a lot about fish processing. And so my first question is, well, what about British workers? And they say, oh, no, they wouldn't do the job. They just wouldn't do it. Not suitable. Then I say, well, what about East European workers? Oh, no, they can't. Then I say, well, what about training? How long does it take to train somebody to fillet frozen mackerel? And he says, 5 years. So I say clearly that I don't know anything about fish, and maybe you're right, but it seems a long time. So it was a British employer, yes. So the further argument is that if you don't provide us with these workers, then we become less competitive, because actually our competitors in Norway, Sweden, who also focus on fishing mackerels and exporting to Japan, they all employ Chinese workers trained in Japan. So they've got their good workers. If you don't give us those workers, we can't compete. So I'm saying this because I just want to illustrate the kind of complexity of the issue, and just to say the question is, well, is it a good idea or bad idea to satisfy this particular demand for migrant workers? Another example, of course, is, there's many examples, but I'll mention one other one, or maybe two other ones. One is, of course, with restaurants, ethnic cuisine restaurants, Indian restaurants, Thai restaurants. This is not just true in the UK, but in many countries. These restaurants will say that they have a demand for cooks, and many will say also for waiters and waitresses, that are from the country where the food in a way comes from. So the Thai restaurant wants a Thai cook, the Indian restaurant wants an Indian or Bangladeshi cook, and the government says, well, no, you should use the Polish bloke, because we have so many East Europeans around. You know, you cannot have. And the restaurants say, well, this is disgraceful, because the customer doesn't want European cooks cooking this food. So the question becomes, who can cook the food? The next question is, well, then restaurants also say, well, when the customer walks into the door in the Thai restaurant, some of them will say, people don't want to be